Welcome everyone to TAM Lab number 53. Today is March 19th, 2020, and we're excited to have Matt Mancini joining us to give an update to his definitive guide around home labs. So this is a blog series that he has published out in the past, and I think he recently updated that for some new things that he's done in his lab. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt. Typically, we like to keep these sessions to a minimum as far as PowerPoint. But I think today we're making the exception because Matt is going to be basically going through, all the guidelines and things you need to consider if you're looking to build out a home lab. So I will stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to Matt and you take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me get the share going here. And let me know when you can see the slide on your screen.
We're good.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. I appreciate it. Quick TAM Lab program note. This is part one, kind of a two-part series. We put two together. Today is the definitive guide. And then part two coming up on April 9th is going to be a home lab roundtable where we'll be taking a lot more of your questions. There's a lot of slides today, a lot of information here. We'll explain a little bit more about the guide and how you can use it with your customers and share with others, right? So for now, we want to try to keep the questions to a little bit of a minimum. Laughter's okay. Laugh all you want. I'll try and be as funny as I can, right? But we'll take questions at the end. So just kind of jot them down so we can get through the content, all right? So when we're talking about the guide, I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I've been with TAM Services since 2011, 30 years in IT, worn just about every hat known to man in IT. I like to say I'm IT day one, right out of college, straight into IT. In fact, I was doing IT when I was in college back in the 90s, if you can believe it. But always had this type of position, love it. Was big in VMUG for a long time, rebooted the VMUG in 2008 in Phoenix, was on the board of directors, helped them out there, 12-time vExpert, member of the CTO ambassadors, and a lot more other stuff. Love Commodore computers. In fact, I'm actually ripping a bunch of disks right now to nib files to convert them for emulators, doing things like that in the back. I'm left-handed and proud of that fact. If you don't know the history of left-handed people, you might look that up, how we were kind of, how shall you say, forced to be righties. My last name actually means left-handed in Italian, if you believe it or not. And then also, part of being a VMware is part of doing foundation work. And that's a picture of my Land Cruiser there. Believe it or not, that is Arizona. And I actually volunteer my time with a nonprofit called Trail, which we actually help the U.S. Forestry Service. So if you're not quite sure if that's Arizona or not, point in case, this was this morning. This is what I woke up to this morning. Snow all over Arizona. And we do get quite a bit of snow. So my personal mantras, okay? Now, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I really do believe that. But hey, I'm no Einstein. But I do run a simple, no-nonsense blog. I get right to the point on things. And that's kind of how I have this slide deck set up. So rule number one, keep it simple, right? Get right to the point. Keep it simple. Explain it simply. If you can do that, you'll get a lot more people understanding what you're talking about. And really, that became the purpose of the Home Labs Definitive Guide. I was getting a lot of questions around from VMUG folks, where do I start? Why should I do this? What are some of your experiences and other experiences? And do you have examples, right? And what should I consider when building a home lab? What are some of the considerations I should think about before I start doing this? And after some deep thought around this and really thinking about it, trying to make it as simple as possible, right? That's when I started building this guide to answer those questions and more. So let's get to the agenda here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is a home lab, why build it, where do I start, various considerations and planning for this. Introduction to the Fantastic Four, make more sense in a little bit. Some recommendations, a little bit that's going on in my personal home lab. I have some helpful links at the bottom. And then stay tuned, listeners. We have a special TAM Lab announcement at the end of this presentation. So don't drop yet. All right, so consider the following for home labs, right? So for the purpose of this conversation, I mean, there are many uses, right? Many uses, but for this presentation, we consider a home lab as pretty much any type of non-production VMware environment meant for personal or development use, right? And depending on, this is the important part, and depending on your expected outcomes, right, and budget, it may contain different, outdated, dislike hardware, or it may not. It could even contain connection to cloud resources, right? So it's really wide what a home lab could be. But for these conversations, we're really talking about VMware home labs and how you might use it for your personal use or development use. And typically it comes down to two types of software types. We have home labs that use workstation and they do nested environments. And then we have home labs that kind of use a vSphere environment. Now they're broader than that. You can get into networking home labs and, you know, all these other different things you could introduce in your home labs. But this one's a little bit more focused on VMware home labs and building those up and some of the ecosystem around that. All right. So why build a home lab? You know, after talking with a lot of people, I've come to realize it's come down to two types of people. There are folks that like hardware, like myself. I love hardware. I love getting my hands in there and unscrewing stuff and building things right from scratch and doing something I never did before with hardware. And then there's folks who like the software aspect and say, hey, I don't want to waste my time building something. I'm going to go buy a commodity server. I want to get it up today. It's good. And I can get into the software, right? So they kind of fit into these two buckets. Some of us fit into a little of both. Some of us are strong in both, right? But if you think about that with home lab building, there's folks that really just enjoy the build aspect of it and folks that like the run aspect of it. And you can use those aspects of your home lab for different reasons. Maybe certification prep is one of your goals. You know, maybe you enjoy installing new products, new software products. Maybe you want to do something different that nobody's done before. I took on InfiniBand in my home lab a couple years ago. That was something different. I have never done InfiniBand before, ever. Not in any of my career, but it was the first time I chose to do it. It was something different, and I learned a lot, right? Maybe you want to confirm a fix. You know, a lot of us on the phone here inside of VMware, we've got customers that might have a fix. And I'm not saying you can do this every time, but maybe you confirm a fix for them in some way. Maybe you confirm a way that software works, or you can communicate better with your customers, or customers that are listening to the call. Maybe this is a way for you to prove something out before you take it to your management so that you can show you're that knowledge leader in their area. That kind of ties into emerging tech, right? It helps you keep ahead of where you're at currently, ahead of where your customers are, or where you're going within your career. Maybe you just want to test a theory out. But really what it comes down to with home labs, for me especially, is, you know, have fun. And this should be fun for you, right? It should be I look forward to working in my home lab. I enjoy it a lot, you know, and gain knowledge with it. And of course, share. Most importantly, share. And that's what this slide deck is about. So feel free to reach out to me. If you like this slide deck, if it's resonating with you and you think it resonates with your customers, I will gladly give it to you. You can have it, you can modify it, make it your own, make it your definitive guide and share it with them. But really, when you start talking about home labs, it comes down to this. Well, not quite like that, but you really do need to have a plan, right? If you act randomly and hope for the best in home labs, you're not going to have a good experience. So have fun, right? But have a good experience too. Okay. So think about it. Where do you start? Have a plan. Remember that Einstein thing? If you can't explain it simply, right? You're not ready. Same thing. Have a plan. Your plan might be getting that bicycle to that flag, but in reality, there's a lot of pitfalls that could be ahead of you. And this is true whether you're doing infrastructure for production use or home labs for non-production use. Run it the same way you would. It's great exercise, you know, especially for the folks, you know, that don't have access to infrastructure anymore, right? And you're a little bit out of practice. You feel like your skills might be slipping a pinch. Home labs are perfect for that. I run my home lab the same way I would have run a production environment. At least I try to, right? I document things. I make sure that everything's in order, you know, those types of things. And it's work, but it's a good experience and it keeps me fresh, right? So start out small and build it up is my recommendation, is really how to start, but have a plan. And that's where we're going to talk a little bit about having a plan. Okay, so where do you start? Resist buying first. That's tip number one. don't go out and buy a lot of things, right? Without a plan. Have a plan. Think about it, right? Think about what are the requirements and outcomes that you want to achieve. You know, what do you want to get? What do you want to do with your home lab, right? What will it involve, like a personal home network? Are you going to combine these two? You know, we talked about the hardware and software types of folks. You know, maybe a little of both. Maybe you don't want to buy, build your own PCs and build this up. Maybe you want to buy something else that is more commodity because you're the software side. So think about that. But really, ask questions, talk with others, gain information, right? So really think about it. Form your ideas. Get a whiteboard. That whiteboard right there, I just did that 2 weeks ago. I'm rebuilding my home lab, sat down, started drawing it out. It's a horrible picture, but it's the start of a plan, right? It's the start of a plan of integrating my home lab into my home network and where it goes from. But it helped me kind of think about those requirements, and I started getting my list together, right? And gaining everything that I need to do, going through my software requirements. We'll see a table here in a minute that'll kind of explain that a little bit better, you know? Review some of the home lab considerations. That's another table coming up we'll go through, right? Some give you some more things to think about. Research what you may need. And lastly, like I said, in my opinion, if you can explain your home lab simply, right? You're probably ready. If you're still asking questions, how am I going to update that firmware? What about this? What about these things? Might not be quite ready, right? And though you could probably dive into this pretty quick and go at it pretty hard, you'll have better luck if you start thinking about these things first, right? So planning out your home lab. So most recently, I call all my home labs different generations. So I had a generation 4 home lab, and I'm recently updated it to 5. And this is how I did it. I documented, you know, all of my home lab generations on my blog and how to migrate them. That's how I keep track of it, right? It helps me to remember. I look back and say, oh, that's how I did Gen 4, right? It's a good way for me, and then it's also a good way to share with others. For generation 5, I actually created 6 videos around my findings and outcomes. And then I kind of actually wrote design considerations blog, actually wrote it out. And I went through these 5 steps in that blog, you know, some of my initial use cases and goals, the software and hardware evaluate and VMware requirements of what I wanted to try to initially do, right? Review all that information, choosing the hardware, finalizing my order, and then finally, and most importantly, learn from your mistakes. So pro tip on this, I think, is use Google Sheets. I love it. You know, I'm not too worried about Google Sheets. I'm going to use it for all my IPs and all my information. I'm okay with that. You know, maybe not the best thing for production use, but for home lab use, it really helps me organize my thought process and what I'm going to do. All right. So here's a helpful chart. These are some of the products I considered when I started planning out. And this is something you might want to think about too. Okay. So if you want to just start out with vCenter Server Standard, VCSA at the top, there's all the minimum, some of the requirements you might have to consider. You might have to consider that, you know, you're going to have 2 vCPUs, right? For this, if you're going to run a tiny vCenter VCSA, and you might have to have 300 gigs of hard disk. But to the right is the recommended link. You can go there and find all this information on these. I've supplied all these to you here. So what I do is I look at this list, check off all the products I want to do, add up all the numbers. Now, of course, these aren't consolidated numbers. We know that, right? It's going to get better, but it gives me a good idea of the load I might be up against. How much hard disk space do I have to plan for? How much memory should I consider? Do I really need all those vCPUs? Do I have enough physical CPUs underneath the hood to support all this, right? Now, home labs typically, not always, typically run a little bit light on CPU, can run heavy on RAM. And disk really depends on your goals. And that's what this is about, is planning it out, figuring out what you need to support your goals. This chart can help you with that. All right. So what should you consider about home labs as far as cost? You know, these are things I think about. How much is it going to cost me to do, right? How about noise? Noise is a big factor. In fact, mine's running in the background right now. You probably can't hear it. I like that aspect of it. I like that it's super quiet. I got no fan noise, right? And following in the next one, low heat. I'm in a relatively decent sized room, but some of us has small home offices where we keep our home labs. And if it's generating a lot of heat and power, it's going to cost me a lot, you know, monthly operational costs, the next one in there, and it's going to be stuffy and hot in my room. What about footprint and mobility? How much space is this thing going to take up? Have I planned that out? Have I thought about that? Where's it going to go? How am I going to plug it into the wall? Right? How am I going to route things to it? Is it too big? Is it too small? And flexibility. Thinking about the products you choose, how flexible is that solution or hardware if you need to expand? You know, I kind of faced that when we were doing home labs and everything was good. Next thing, vSAN came out. It's like, oh no, how am I going to support extra drives in the chassis, right? How am I going to add additional controllers? So that flexibility, think about the future too, right? And bleeding edge products, same thing, right? Thinking about those products that are coming down the line. Now that's harder to plan for, right? But the more you think about those types of things, how flexible it is, and can I support bleeding edge products? Can I get any HCL support for a home lab is a good thing. It's not required because this isn't a supported solution by VMware. Your home lab is not going to be supported by VMware. Okay, let's just put it that way, right? Most of us are running things that aren't even meant to be running VMware, and that's what a home lab is, right? Now, some of us have enterprise and align better to the HCL, and you're probably going to have a better experience. That kind of goes back to that, am I a hardware or am I a software type of person? If I like software, I'm probably going to lend more towards the HCL and buy commodity things because I have a good experience, right? How about refresh cost? Bought this home lab, put a significant investment in it to get it started up. Now it's time to upgrade. I've been through 5 different generations. These are just the generations I've tracked. I've been through more than that. But how much does it cost to redo those things? And then, of course, speed to use, okay? This is, you know, how quick can your hardware solution be deployed and is useful to you? I think that's an important one as well. That's that software hardware thing. All right, so building up your home lab. Let's talk a little bit about that and introduce you to the Fantastic Four here. Oh, I'm sorry, not that Fantastic Four. This Fantastic Four. So these are what I consider the Fantastic Four around building up your home lab. We have hosts, we've got the network aspects of it, we've got storage, and then rounding it up, we've got licensing when you're thinking about building things up. So let's start off with hosts. So hosts are going to come in many flavors, okay? One thing I'd would recommend you do is think about your host as a building block, okay? Start off with what you have, but think about how can you repurpose and reuse that and build from that device into a larger home lab. So, you know, a laptop that you might have today might work really well with Workstation, and that's a good thing to do. No doubt about it. And those VMs are portable. So when you start building up your home lab and you start getting into workstations or microservers or whatever it is, you can move those into them. But when you choose a, you know, like the workstation there in the middle, that HP workstation, great choice. You know, it's a good building block, right? You can buy a couple of those down the road. Maybe you buy one for now, you buy another one in a few months, and maybe a year or two, you buy another one, you know? So you have that building block mentality behind what you're doing. That helps you with that refresh cost we were talking about earlier and helping you to maintain and kind of grow your lab out. So these are the various things you think about: laptops, NUCs, microservers, build it yourself, enterprise class servers are some common building blocks, right? So talking about those a little bit more. So nested workstation, okay? So these are the classifications that I kind of see home labs getting into, okay? So nested workstation typically runs VMware Workstation or Fusion. It might be, you know, used for nested virtualization. It could run, you know, Windows OS, Mac OS, Linux, et cetera, as the base OS. Usually a PC or laptop work really well for this, or a workstation class computer. Again, think building block, right? You might buy a beefy workstation, you know, PC, and later on repurpose it for ESXi. Could very well be done. Lots of cores, not lost. Lots of cores. I'd recommend at least six physical cores or more. Lots of RAM, multiple drives, et cetera. And we'll get into that. And then category 2 that I'm kind of seeing coming up, mobile or compact cluster. These are the types, the NUCs, the Minimax, super micros, those micro servers, right? And usually this is a cluster. Now we're getting into cluster ones, right? So they usually consist of 3 or more. They're really dense, really small. They have a lot of advantages to it. They only typically have one vCPU, can have some RAM, 1 to 2 slots, NVMe, Thunderbolt. They have some good things going for them, right? And then 3, business workstation or white box cluster. This is either build it yourself or go buy like an HP workstation or a Dell workstation, right? Similar, a lot of these come with dual CPUs, which is nice. You give lots of expansion, lots of things to run. Typically, you run an ESXi on this. And then finally wrapping this up, we've got the enterprise server class, which are your Dells, your HPs, your super micro physical servers, right? You might consist 3 of these. You have lots of CPU, lots of RAM. Those are the classifications. Now the question is how do these classifications compare when we look at the design considerations? And that's what this chart is for. This chart gives you kind of a baseline, and it's going to vary, right? This is all about what you want to achieve with your home lab. This is just an idea of how you can kind of compare things, right? So when we look at the classifications across the top, nested workstation, moving to the right all the way over to the server class and down, we can kind of compare these on different aspects. Now, one could argue that you might say your server class isn't that loud, and that could be. Maybe you did some modifications and pulled out some fans and rearranged it and did some stuff and it's not loud. Great. By default, this is how things are. So keep that in mind, right? There are mods you can do and changes. We all get that, right? So and this is kind of the initial cost you might consider as well. So a workstation, you might, I don't know, $800 to $1,200 to get started. It really depends on your thing. The good thing about workstations and mobile clusters and white box clusters, you can typically keep that noise down. That's great for home offices. And typically their power is a lot less than the server class, right? That also reduces your monthly cost. Then we get into mobility, okay? So for a nested workstation, of course, a laptop, you can move that anywhere. If you use a NUC or a PC, again, you can move it around. A mobile cluster, those are great. I've seen a lot of folks, putting them in cases and moving around and doing customer demos. They'll get 3 or 4 NUCs, a switch, put it in a case, stick it on an airplane, take it to places. They're great for mobility. They're awesome. The workstation cluster or the white box cluster, they're typically a little bit large, right? They're larger, they're not very mobile. And same with kind of your server class. Again, not mobile, they're meant to stay in place. So then we get into flexibility. So we start thinking about flexibility, that's where I think the workstation design using VMware Workstation, it's somewhat flexible. You can do a lot of things with it, but you're limited, right? Same with the mobile NUCs, right? You're limited a little bit, right? You can't go out and buy the cheapest PCIe card and stick it in it. There's no slot for it. It just doesn't have it. It's not made for that, right? But they have benefits and other things. Whereas the business class workstations and white box clusters, you pretty much have commodity parts in general that you can put in. And same way with the server class. When we talk about flexibility and adding things to it, they're relatively, I'm kind of saying the server class is relatively flexible. There are some things you can run into with the server class that you just can't do, that you can do with the white box. For example, I could go out and pretty much pick a lot of different cards and stick it in a white box. Some of the BIOS in server classes are now tailored to not accept those cards anymore. So it kind of limits you to how flexible you could be when you're building a home lab. And then bleeding edge products. Again, I think most of these are pretty flexible and can align to bleeding edge. You can adjust them in some way. Workstation's a little bit limited through its nesting capabilities. Other than that, we've got some pretty good flexibility, right? HCL support. Very limited across the board with the exception of the server class. As we know, they're probably on the HCL. And for this purpose, that isn't about getting support. That's more about planning for, am I going to have problems or not? okay? Then refresh and usability, right? So how could you reuse what you have and repurpose it moving forward? Workstation, it depends on what you're doing, right? In the mobility cluster area and the business class workstation, you can, buy new and ads and different ads. The white box cluster is probably the most flexible. You can gut that thing and put it all back, new parts, commodity parts that are really cheap. And then the server class, you might have some ads or buy a few new parts, but not too many much. Not as quite as flexible as the white box cluster. And speed to use. Workstation today. It's so quick. Get it up, get it running, get online, find some scripts, get going. It's a great way to plan out your home lab too. Mobile clusters, again, they're pretty quick. There's a lot of information out there. Same with the business workstation cluster and I think the server class. This is where I think the white box cluster, build it yourself, is not as quick. Depending on your plan and what you're doing, you might run into different compatibility issues. You're trying to do things you've never done before, like sticking InfiniBand cards in your host, right? And all the firmware updates, and it can be a little bit more troublesome because you're piecing it together, right? So these are some things you consider. These are the different classifications I've seen out there, and this is kind of how you can compare these together. Okay, so I want to give you an idea of a building block example real quick. In 2003, I bought a case. I have used that case all the way up to 2020, the same case. And I bought two more around, I think, 2011 and built it up. And even to most recently, this is the end of my Gen 4 home lab, I still use those cases. That's an example of repurposing the same case for 17 years. I made that investment a long time ago. I've been able to gut and repurpose that thing over and over and over again. And that's kind of that building block example. When you're building your stuff up, think about how can you repurpose this? This is your dollars coming out of your pocket, probably funding this, right? That's one of the things I think about is how can I do that? All right, some trends I'm seeing for 2020 around hosts, okay? 4-core CPUs are really struggling to keep up with the demands, and we'll see that in the table coming up. Hyper-threading is a dying technology. My opinion, shouldn't be considered as cores for home labs. Really, and then also, the E5 Xeons, the older ones, have completely plummeted in price. So they're a great value. You can get E5 Xeons for, V2 through 4 for $20 to $80 a piece, and you get a lot of cores going, right? There's some new system boards out there on the market too. The Chinese market has made a bunch from if you look for X79 or X99 system boards, if you're building it yourself, right? They have Socket 2011, they're falling in price, 85 to 140 bucks for a dual processor system board, 16 cores with maybe $50 in processors. And you've got one heck of a great workstation board there, a good building block. RAM, I'd say you really want to get your numbers up, start looking at 128 gig or better. Depending on your cluster size. If you have a lot of machines, you don't need a lot of RAM. But if you have 3 systems or so, you might consider getting a lot of RAM. DDR3 and DDR4, mostly 3, prices for ECC memory have really dropped. You can get 128 gig easily, 100 a quarter, somewhere in that range for DDR3. DDR4 is a little bit more expensive. HBAs, so all types of host bus cards. I've been hearing some reports out there on enterprise servers not accepting all HBAs. So again, if you have this enterprise class server like a Dell server or something, HP server, and you think that you're going to go stick that Mellanox HBA card in it, it might not work, or it might cause your fans to go to 100% because it's unsupported. I've been hearing some folks like on Server for the Home and places like that starting to pipe up about that. And then laptops, this is really, I think they're coming of age. These processors are getting so darn good, whether they're in a processor or in your workstation, and they're getting a lot more cores. 6 cores is very common now. And it's a really good approach for workstation for home labs, especially with the cores are up. You get lots of RAMs in laptops now. Make sure you get SSDs or NVMe sticks in there, and you've got a recipe for a really good starting place. And they're really starting to come of their age, especially I think since the cores and the disk speeds have gone way up. All right. Next one, networking. So a couple different things that are common types for networking. So things you might look at. You might consider having a layer 3 switch, something with VLANs, right? PoE is nice, power over Ethernet. A lot of folks like that because they might be running, cameras or the other home automation devices in their house. A layer 3 switch, VLAN managed, they're not that expensive anymore. This example, this Power Connect here, I think it was under $50, right? And then one thing you might want to look for too is you're thinking about your home lab is that speed, right? Though it's a 24 ports of 1 gigabit, you might look for ones that have SFP plus, right? With 10 gigabit. Now this switch doesn't have that, but there are a lot of switches out there that do. And that might be a great approach. Your back-end network, whether you're running vSAN or whatever you need to do, you've got a couple ports of 10 gig to run out. And then you've got, for all your VMs, you got 1 gig out the front end. So look for those types of switches. There's a lot of them out there that you can find. Don't forget the good old Ethernet crossover cables. They're incredibly popular. And also the DAC cables for these, the SFP DAC cables are relatively cheap, good options for keeping, for getting into 10 gig, right? And then also, if you haven't considered InfiniBand, you might consider InfiniBand. Heck, they've been doing 10 gig since 2001. They were so far ahead of the curve, right? It's out there. There's a lot of information out there on InfiniBand. You can also use the cables. If you have just the cards, you can do InfiniBand cables from 2 or 3 different machines and make them work together. You don't necessarily need to have a switch. There are challenges with InfiniBand. There's some links at the end of this presentation. I've got a lot of blogs on it. If you got questions about it, definitely reach out. But think about this. As vSAN is starting to evolve, more and more pressure on low latency networks. That's where InfiniBand has its value. That's where RDMA has its value, okay? So think about that as you're planning things out. Now, trends for 2020 around networking, I'm really noticing, like I said, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. The trend for vSAN, things like that, RDMA, you might start looking into that a little bit more. And also the price of 10 gigabit Ethernet is really starting to fall a bit. I wouldn't say a lot. Look for those, switches that have the 10 gigs and SFP plus with DAC cables is a good option. And then if you're looking for a cheap, and I mean cheap, but new, 10 gig switch, you might consider MikroTik. They have a few different models out here that are relatively affordable. I think the switch on the top, which is 8 ports of SFP plus, you can get that guy for right around maybe $250-ish. The one on the bottom, which is four ports, it's going for like $100, $115. So if you just need a quick 10 gig network to get up, nothing fancy, no frills, you might consider MikroTik. Fair warning, their CLI is not intuitive. It's not like Cisco or any other CLI any other way. It can be a challenge. All right, storage. So some of your options for storage for home labs, you might consider OpenFiler. You might consider FreeNAS, right? TrueNAS is another good one. And you might consider different storage arrays as well, whether it be personal or SMBs, those types of things. They're a good option. And you might also consider vSAN as one of your options for storage. I'm sure there's more other options out there. These are some of the common ones, and they all have different advantages, right? Different things you might want to think about. So considering, thinking about your storage, what you might want to do, and this goes back to your plan, right? What do I want to do with storage? vSAN's a great option. I mean, it is. But in reality, a lot of our customers are still running NFS. And we need to be aware of how NFS works, right? Or we need to understand how iSCSI works. And that's where, this chart's kind of showing you, think about these different options. How do they work with one another? What are you trying to achieve, right? And buying a simple small array, like I had a iOmega iX4 for a long time. That thing taught me NFS. I had iSCSI with it. I had file shares out of it. I used that thing for a long time. It was about 8 years I had that. And finally the Java, and they had no more, they gave no more updates for it, and the Java started breaking, and that was the end of it. But I learned a ton around just having a nice small little storage device there, and it helped me relate better with my customers and the companies I worked for and whatnot. So powered by vSAN. Absolutely. This is something you might think about too. And what a good use case for a home lab, because, literally we don't want, some of us, not all of us, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, some of us don't necessarily want an array in our home office, right? It's power hungry, it's noisy, it requires a lot of moving parts versus, we know the benefit here, hyper-converged, right? We get 3 servers and a bunch of disks, and aligned to it as the HCL as best we can. And we've got a storage array that really serves us well in home labs. So, all right, so trends I'm seeing in storage for 2020. Okay, used enterprise SAS disk, flash and NVMe, these prices are definitely dropping, so look to those. However, fair warning, okay? There are a lot, and shouldn't say NetApp has flooded, but there are a lot of NetApp drives out there that are used, and they're cheap, okay? They're very cheap. You can pick up 5 of these for $40. However, do not do this. These drives are branded, they look like IBM, Hitachi, Seagate, but they have NetApp part numbers on it. The problem is these drives use a 520 byte sector versus a standard 512 byte sector. This means that your controller, depending on your controller, your disk controller, might not recognize the drive at all. This is where the laughter comes in. Lessons learned, right? How do I know this? I know this because I bought a bunch of cheap drives on eBay and ran into this problem. Shame on me, bad planning. I should have planned better. I should have done some research, but I figured a SAS drive was a SAS drive. All enterprise SAS drives are not created equal, especially if they come out of storage arrays. Do a little homework, bring up those part numbers, see if there's problems. I did it with a lot of other things. I just didn't do it with drives. I got a little too comfortable there. I made a mistake. And that's part of learning, right? No laughter? Oh, someone's got to laugh at that. You're laughing in the background, I'm sure.
I'm laughing. At least it was only like $40, right?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad of a lesson. They're still sitting here right next to me, and I'm hoping I find a way to upgrade their firmware. All right. So moving on to licensing. So licensing comes into 3 areas that you need to consider. So VMs, networking, and storage. Oh, that's kind of odd. Why would you list networking and storage? Depends what you buy. So let's talk about that a little bit. So, so for VMs, I would consider, if you're looking for Microsoft operating systems, things like that, a Visual Studio account is a good way to go, right? You get access to everything, you can download everything, and of course, Linux is out there too. A lot of us run these 2 common operating systems, and they're great for that. We also have Photon from VMware. There's another one. So there's a lot of different options there. Consider those. Networking. When you buy switches, especially used, they might have licensed features on them that don't enable the entire switch. Definitely make sure that when you're buying a switch, that it's fully licensed, okay? InfiniBand, this is a must, okay? If you're buying InfiniBand switches, you need to make sure they're licensed or come with a license, else it won't be enabled and you'll just have a brick. You might ask, how do I know this? Because I have an InfiniBand switch that was almost a brick, but I was able to work with the vendor and figure it out. I got lucky. But make sure you ask your questions. And storage array is the same way. Depending on what type of storage array you buy, it might or might not be licensed. So it's something to think about and ask about before you put your money down, right? What about VMware licensing? Okay. Now, I'm not advocating this first one, but depending on what you're doing for your company may have keys that you're able to use to build out your home lab. And of course, they own the keys. Now, you need to check your licensing agreements on this. And like I said, I'm not recommending this first approach. I really think, working with your account team, we might have some options for you. If you're a VMware partner, you might consider looking at NFR keys, right? But definitely, check your software license. There are some options here, right? And kind of think about those things, but there are other options, right? You might consider doing VMUG Advantage. This is a great program. For $200 a year, you get all these advantages here in green, whether it's discount on training, yearly evaluation licenses, et cetera. So let's look at that a little bit more. So here are some of the licenses you get with that. you pretty much get all the licenses you need to spin up your home lab and do a lot of work. It's a great option. And then the other option you might consider is becoming a VMware vExpert. The VMware vExpert isn't about, hey, I'm the best at what I do. I'm so smart, look at me. No, it's not. It's not that type of expert. You're an expert in your field, of course, but you're also sharing with the community and you're giving back to the community. And that's what the program's about, is sharing with others in the community, learning from each other and growing. And it's about, what have you shared? Have you done VMUG presentations? Have you been active on Twitter? Have you done blogging? Have you done all the above, videos, etc.? Those are things that can qualify you for this program. So don't be afraid to apply. Even as an employee, you can become a vExpert. And when you do, you get licenses. Again, here's another way to get VMware licenses to get your home lab started if you're struggling for that. All right, here's some of my recommendations for getting started. Again, like you've heard me say before, start with VMware Workstation. Again, draw up that plan. You know, PC or laptops are great. I don't think this is time wasted. When you're playing with Workstation, it is a great development environment. There's low risk here, right? But always think about those building blocks, right? So recommendations for hardware on that, you know, your typical PC, Macs, laptops, NUCs, workstation class, right? Check the requirements just to make sure. Lots of RAM. You're going to need at least a NIC or two. I'd highly recommend a 6-core or better CPU. Fast disk access is an absolute must for Workstation. You're going to be bottleneck in Workstation if you're trying to run lots of VMs under heavy disk load and you're still running traditional magnetic hard disks. It's going to choke it. If your only option is hard drives, right? Distribute your VMs across multiple hard disks. You'll have, you know, a better experience there. Again, cost-effective way to do this. And the con I kind of see with Workstation where I ran into is I had a lot of difficulty doing external routing or bringing storage devices into physical storage devices in. It's really not made for that. It doesn't work well. So you do hit some limitations. You can do vSAN in there. You know, you can do all these types of things and experiment with it. And the nice thing is that when you build the VMs, most of them are pretty portable out. So you can save some time there as you move ahead. My recommendation for home labs, it really depends, again, on what you're trying to do. I'm a hardware guy. I like playing with the hardware. So I always drop my plan, go with VMUG Advantage, you know, think about those building blocks like we talked about. Don't forget about your networking, DNS, you know, your IP address schemes and DHCP, all very important in your home lab. Use your workstation PC to house some services. I absolutely do this all the time. Even though I have ESXi servers, I still rely on Workstation as part of my design to build things and create things or just start things, you know. It is a really good thing to have. And you're thinking about those building blocks, maybe your laptop is your first building block. You got Workstation on it, that's great. And then you invest in a bigger home lab and you could still use that investment you have in Workstation to help kind of move your other hosts along. For hosts, you know, kind of to get started out, you know, 3 is a really good number. Layer 3 switch, definitely you want to go with 10 gig Ethernet if you can have it, definitely for that back end, again, depending on your requirements, and then some sort of storage device. I look for, when I build my host, I look for cases. I tend to fit more towards the white box area. I look for cases that'll support either micro ATX or ATX, even extended ATX motherboards now, right? There's a lot of those starting to come into play. Lots of drive bays, easy to work on, cheap is cheap, and it fits those commodity parts. I really want motherboards that are 64 gig or better. ECC memory or not really a big factor here. I'm more about price. And I'm always looking for good CPU support when I look at these motherboards. What can I put into it today and what can I put up into it tomorrow, right? How many you know, PCIe ports is important. I'd look for motherboards that have, you know, how many 4X or better PCI ports I can get. And really, I want to look more for 8. But don't, because you buy a motherboard, don't forget that even though that X16 or 16X, whatever you want to call it, video port looks like it's a video card only, it's not. That's not. It can be used for standard cards, right? You don't have to use it for video only. check with the manufacturer and double verify that. Some of them have some special things they do. But in general, I've never had a problem putting any type of PCIe card into a 16X slot. In fact, I use them all the time on my motherboard design. Okay. If you want headless, a good thing to search for is AST2400. It's a chipset that a lot of manufacturers use. Supermicro in particular, Gigabyte's another one, and they can do actual remote access to your systems if you want it. Of course, NVMe support. Lots of, I'd look for SAS-based hard disks if you can get it, if you can afford them, and SSDs. Again, hard disks, at least one, right? And then booting from USB or flash is always a preferred way to go. Power supplies, look for efficient as possible. Try and keep those numbers down. There's a lot of different power supplies out there. Sure, you can pick up a $23 power supply. Sure, you could do it. It's probably going to burn up. It's probably going to use a lot of power. It's not very efficient. Look for those 80+ ratings on those power supplies or better, right? And then I think that the advantages of doing this, longevity. This type of design, I can go over and over. I can control my costs. I can manage flexibility, low noise and low heat, and overall size can be a bit bulky for some designs. Again, these are just my suggestions, what I do, and this is what it looks like today. This is my home lab here. It's still kind of under development. Don't knock me too hard for having blue LED fans. The cases were cheap. That's all I got to say, right? And they were flexible. That's why I bought them. I got to figure out a way how to take out that shiny blue disco lights. But here's what I have. I have dual Xeons in there, 128 gigs each. I'm running vSAN in hybrid mode because that aligns to what I'm trying to do right now. I've got a back-end 10 gig network. I'm currently running vSphere 6.7. I run Workstation 15 as well. And I plan to install the entire stack. For me, what's next? Once I get that done, and when I say entire stack, let me take a step back. That's more about the entire vSphere stack onto this environment in some way. Okay, so what's next for me? Probably doing some Kubernetes work and looking at, and then also home automation. It's something I want to get into a little bit more. I've been doing some power control items in the home with lights and stuff. I will also want to do that to kind of meter, measure, and control my home lab. Power things on, power things off. All right, so if you're interested in more information around that, check out my blog at vmexplorer.com. You can also find me on YouTube and Twitter. Just click on the blog series right there, and you'll actually see all my generations, all the videos around what I've been doing and what I've been up to, a lot of tips and tricks out there. Starting to wrap this up a little bit. We're getting into the links. Will be published for you guys, various different links on some of the products and things I've talked about today, and information. If you're interested in InfiniBand, I definitely take a look at those 2 YouTube videos. You will learn just about everything you need to know about getting started with InfiniBand if you sit down and watch 2 hours of videos. It was incredibly helpful for me. All right, and with that, we are into our special announcement. We need fanfare, I think, Steve, but you need a button for that.
Okay, let me find something real quick.
All right. So our special announcement today is 2 things. I've been working with a little bit with the TAM Labs things, and we're doing 2 things. TAM Labs is starting an internal list of employees with home labs. Steve is going to be putting out a SharePoint site here real soon, and you'll be able to list your home labs. But you're probably thinking, well, aren't we doing that with like William Lambs? He's doing an external, and that's cool. We're starting an internal list of employees. Why? Well, not only do we share information like we're doing today, but also it's about being a force for good. And if you've been reading most recently on Twitter, one of the things that's trending right now is Amanda, William, and many others. There's too many to mention here. These are just 2 to get started, right? They're doing a project with Folding at Home. And what they're doing is they're actually using this to help battle the coronavirus. Okay, so using your laptop, using your PC, using your home lab, right? I think you're getting the drift here now. So they're working to come out with a Photon instance that you can deploy in your home lab and start crunching numbers. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at that real quick. So here is Folding at Home. I got it running on my PC right now. And one of the things I can look at, I wanted to validate, say, okay, they're saying they're doing this Corona thing. I want to make sure they are. So right there in the middle where it's highlighting in green says running, to the right, it says project. When I click on project, I can actually go and see the project that I'm actually crunching numbers for. And sure enough, it relates right to this project number, which is right around the coronavirus SARS-2, I guess you could call it, right? Here's Steve's lab that he posted up the other day. As you can see, he's got 8 different instances running right now.
Yeah, I actually have
Crunching
10
away.
now.
He's got 10 now. There you go. That's awesome. And one of the things we started noticing is if there's a bunch of information here. So, you know, you can get this installed on your laptop, for example, and then you can use this to kind of add different hosts, and you can see all their stats at once. You can see how many points that you're helping out with, the status, all types of good information, right? One thing I think Steve and I started to notice is when we look at the processing power, home labs are great, but this program seems to align a little bit better to GPUs. And it could be that the types of project you get could depend on the types of data that you're crunching depend on the type of hardware that you have. Whereas my PC per day, it's crunching a lot because it has GPUs in it. I have my, what I call MCP, that's an old Tron reference if you remember that, is my workstation name, the master control program. He's running right now, and he's crunching, he's clicking along here. I mean, he's 11,000 points per day he's going to do, right? So with those GPUs help out a lot. So if you got a spare laptop, if you got a workstation PC with a good GPU in it, you know, get Folding at Home installed and get it up and running, join our team, right? And here's how you do that. Once you download the product, basically just go through the setup steps. It's pretty simple. Set up an identity, okay? I put in VM Explorer for me. I put in our team ID 52737 and save. Whammo, it started doing it. This is the web interface that'll pop up on your PC. You go down to your control panel. So I apologize. I only know the Windows steps. I don't know the Linux steps. So I should reiterate that. So what you can do then is you right click on the down there by the clock and you bring up the control panel and you can see everything that's going on. From there, you can add in additional machines you've installed it to, whether they're VMs or different workstations and whatnot, and you can get a good view of what you're doing. More information for Folding at Home can be found here. We'll supply that to you. And with that, that is
Awesome.
what we had for you guys today.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. So real quick, a little bit more about the Folding at Home. Dean, if you're out there, feel free to unmute yourself.
You go back one slide for me.
So Dean's been doing a ton of work on this on the back end here. So Matt, if you can back up a slide.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Sorry.
And how's this, by the way, for the fanfare? I'll have to keep that on hand next time. All right, take it away, Dean.
So just there on the second image, you can see where it says passkey. So if you go to the website link, you can get a passkey from the Folding at Home project. Don't use your VMware address. Use a Google Mail or Hotmail or whatever it is. Just use that's external, just because we seem to be spam filtering at the moment. That passkey essentially authenticates you as a user. It gives you additional points on the leaderboards if you're really bothered about points. Whether or not it gives you additional work units or not, we're not sure about, but it's always worth doing as well. So yeah, I have been helping Amanda and William on this for the last 3 days of my life. It feels like a lot longer now. So if you want to get involved, there is an internal Slack channel called FAH. Steve's just posted that in the chat for us. We've got all the details in there so you can download the OVA now. We are not quite ready to publish this publicly. So if you do download the OVA, please do not pass this out outside of VMware just yet until we post into the channel. But yeah, we've been doing really, really well. Amanda's been posting various updates. Yesterday, we were doing over 1 million points a day, which is massive. We've jumped up massively, and I think Amanda's slightly annoyed that HP and Red Hat are slightly ahead of us still. But the main thing is kind of using our spare CPUs and processors and so forth to, you know, be that force for good. I don't know if it's been picked up on the microphone, but I can actually sat next to my other MacBook, which is currently running as well, and the fan's running at full speed because it's running a workload at the moment. So yeah, it's really easy to get into. There's a set of instructions on the FAH page. You can ask all questions. A few of us have sat up for the last couple of days answering questions as well. Sean Matty has just started to do it so you can pass the GPU into the OVA as well and do GPU workload through the OVA, which is really cool. So yeah, please do get involved.
Right. And I think this is why we're starting this list here on TAM Lab is we actually started it before this project came out. We started talking about it, and we really wanted to have an enabler internally for Tech for Good. And this is a perfect example of how being on that list, we can help promote that internally for things that come up like this. We've got this community of folks. Let's share, right? And let's use our Tech for Good.
All right, so with that, we're at the top of the hour. Matt, this has been amazing, so thank you for doing it. Couple of reminders for everybody. We do have a great session next week scheduled that Dale is going to be doing around the VCF Lab Constructor, which is essentially deploying a VMware Cloud Foundation environment nested. So that should be very interesting as it relates to home lab stuff. And then also there's an upcoming home lab session on, I think it's April 9th, Home Lab 101 Roundtable that Jody's going to be moderating. So I'm sure a lot of you have questions around everything that was talked about today. So bring your questions to that session. And we're basically just going to have a panel of folks that are home lab savvy and can answer whatever questions you have. So that's all I got. Any other questions from anybody? Last call, or I'll let you go here.